Last week we followed Abraham's journey down to Egypt, and we spoke about how Abraham stopped listening, worshipping and following the Lord. So when he left near Beersheba there at Mamre, near Hebron, he took a decision to go down south, and there was a drought, a famine, and he decided that he would head down. But he was not talking to the Lord at this point in time, and he went under his own steam. And we heard about how when he did that, we had this situation arise whereby he went from worrying about a drought to actually losing his wife Sarai to the Pharaoh. And of course, the story tells us that the Pharaoh found out and gave him Sarai back, and Abraham was blessed and returned back to the land of Canaan, where he then separated with his nephew Lot. Because their herds were so large, they were having, competition for the resource that was available, and they had to separate into the two areas. So Lot went down at the bottom of where the Dead Sea is today in the Valley of Jordan, and he grazed his flocks there, and Abraham stayed in the land of Canaan. So that's sort of where we're up to last week. So this week we're going to sort of pause the story in terms of the journey, and we're going to have a look at this topic, God, paganism and idol worship. Now it's a significant topic, and it's one that we don't normally cover. It's not one that you're usually going to hear from the pulpit, but it's really important in the Bible, because all the way through the Bible we encounter these stories whereby people are worshipping idols. For me, it's a case of stopping and saying, well, hang on a second, what were these idols? What did people believe? And why were they actually worshipping them? All right, so we know that Abraham, he was called out of Ur, and as I mentioned in the previous lessons, Ur was a city where they worshipped the moon god, and so Abraham grew up worshipping this god, but there was also a pantheon of gods, so there's many other gods around as well. So every city that you would go to in ancient times, they would worship various false gods, and in fact sometimes they'd be worshipping multiple false gods, and from city to city those false gods would actually be different as well. Of course, when Abraham went down to the Pharaoh was also worshipped as a god. So we have this incident all the way through the Old Testament in which gods are being worshipped in place of our Lord. So we're going to have a look at this, and I'm going to begin by asking you a few questions. So first of all, we talk about Abraham having a monotheistic relationship with God. So that means that Abraham was only having a relationship with God and with no other. So he wasn't worshipping or following any other gods. Remember, he was called out of Ur, and he was in the situation whereby he was actually following what God actually asked him to do. So he was in relationship with God. Now, when the Holy Bible focuses on Abraham, we find out that God's not speaking to any other people at this point in time, or so we think, but the reality is we learn in the Bible that God is actually speaking to other people at the same time. So the story of Abraham and how we read the Bible often means that we think, well, that's the only thing that's going on. But of course there's people everywhere, and there's other things going on at the same time. So we're going to have a look at that. So monotheism at the time of Abraham basically wasn't practiced. So God called Abraham out to make a people for himself. So that means everybody else was actually worshipping multiple gods. Okay, so societies were what we call polytheistic, so they worshipped multiple or numerous gods. But there's another term, and it's called henotheism. Has anyone ever heard of henotheism, or a henotheistic worship? So what this is it's actually when people worship God, our Heavenly Father, and they also worship or have idols for other gods at the same time. So when we go on this journey in the Bible, we find that this is really, really prevalent. Anyone want to have a stab at some people? Who was worshipping God and other gods at the same time in the Bible that we know?
Solomon.
Solomon. So Solomon was a big one. Solomon was somebody who put up many different high places and altars to various gods for all the wives that he married. So Solomon's a good example. Anyone else? What about closer to Abraham? What's an example of somebody that joins their family or is part of their family that worships the Lord but also had other idols as well?
Lot.
Sorry, Lot? Yes. And so it's very close. And then we just move along a little bit to Jacob when he married Rachel and Leah and Laban. It talks about how when they were coming back, that Rachel actually had a couple of idols hidden underneath her seat on the camel.
Yeah.
So these were what we call household idols. So people would call them, they're almost like charms or small items that they place in the house, and they believe that if they have them there, that they will be protected. It's very normal in this day and age in many countries as well. It hasn't really changed. So this is a situation at this particular point in time. So when we believe in God as our creator, we believe that all creation, and this is from a lot of this comes out of Genesis, but we believe that all creation came forth at the free and sovereign command of God. So that's what we learn in the creation story itself. The ancient civilizations, they saw the God of Abraham and his descendants as just another God. So you can imagine that context, right, where in the Bible it says that God is called the God of heaven, the Most High God, and the Most High God who made heaven and earth. So, we just got some more visitors. So we hear here how they're described by these various names that God has, right? But a couple of these names, one says the God of heaven, and the other one says the Most High God who made heaven and earth. So ancient civilizations wouldn't see that as God the Creator. Ancient civilizations would see that as the God of heaven, the God of earth, in the same way they saw the God of fertility, the God of war, the God of fish. They had gods for all sorts of different things. Okay? So we have this situation where when people saw Abraham, what happened with Abraham for the first time? He built an altar and he worshipped God, but he didn't have anything physical that he was worshipping with him. He didn't have a statue, he didn't have any poles, he didn't have any of those things at all. So he's in the land of Canaan and he's bowing down to the Lord, and anybody who's witnessing him will see him apparently worshipping what appears to be nothing, because you can't see God. Today, a lot of the times they talk about deities, right? So these are creating gods and goddesses. So they don't stop at the physical observation of nature, but they expand it to all aspects of human experience. So we talk about love. These are some examples: love, fertility, war, food harvest, hunting, and so much more. There was just gods for everything. And so they have these pantheons. So the point of all of this is that for us to believe in God, we actually have to have faith. So the people who had false gods, or have them today, they don't actually have faith in the real God, do they? Because they're worshipping something that they can see that's in front of them. So this is a difficulty which is still experienced to this day. So those people who don't have faith believe, as I said, what their senses tell them, and these people make their own gods and give them powers and titles. Okay? So, I was watching a video just the other week where in India, with the Brahmin bulls, you had these Brahmin priests, and they train these bulls to lift up their foreleg and touch it on the back of people. So people bow down, and these bulls, so they think that they're being blessed by this animal. It's quite an extraordinary thing. There's a video which I was just watching about a Brahmin lady who now lives in America, and she talks about her experience growing up, and she said she was very religious. She said, but the scripture that actually turned her life around was Isaiah 44, which we're going to have a look at, and it's when it talks about how we cut down the tree, and we take half of that tree and we create something. We carve it, we paint it, we adorn it, and we call this an idol. And yet with the other half of the same tree, they chop it up for firewood and cook their dinner on it. So obviously that sort of physical thing means that they can't be a real God. Okay, and yet people to this day still do it. You know, if you go to India, you know, they have all these idols, they make them every year, they float them down the river Ganges, they set fire to them, and then the poor people pull them out of the river further down and they reprocess them for the following year. So obviously these aren't living gods, and yet people worship these things, so it's still happening today. So Abraham's descendants, the Bible will show us, will actually worship things made out of wood and stone. Okay, so the Bible tells us that despite experiencing God himself, that this is going to happen. But in order to come to faith in God, mankind cannot worship any form of idol or false god. Okay, so when Jesus Christ was born in the flesh, Greek and Roman gods were still worshipped in the region. Okay, there was still, the Bible doesn't talk a lot about it, but there was all these gods in this region. It was controlled by the Romans, and the Romans had taken over from the Greeks. So there was all of these other things that were still being worshipped in the land. But Christianity did not start because of this Gentile, non-Jewish idol worship. Okay, Christianity started because God's people, even after they had stopped worshipping idols, were out of relationship with God. Okay, Christianity was birthed out of Judaism, people who were actually worshipping God, Abraham's God. Okay, so as Christian people, we are the next step as Gentiles. From Judaism, not from idol worship. So the thing is that even though they stopped worshipping the idols, they were obeying laws. So God gave laws, right? So he gave them a purpose in how they were to actually conduct their life. But they failed here. They failed in the heart, right? Because we can follow laws as people. We can be governed by religious activity and all sorts of worship, right? But is our heart in the right place? Now we can be obedient driving a car on the road and not break the road rules, and yet we can be in a complete road rage inside of our car. Right? So our heart is actually not in the right place, even though we're following the laws. And this is one of the actual problems. So the failure there was that they didn't understand that the kingdom of God was one of service and love. So love is where it comes into this. So the presence of Jesus, who came in the physical form, capable of using divine powers to perform miracles, not only demonstrated his divinity, but he also came to reveal God's love for his people. Jesus taught there was no place for the law without love. So he's changing things. You know, people are used to following rules, regulation, but you can do this in idol worship as well. This is the part of the problem. You know, we're not actually walking in relationship with the Lord. We're walking following laws. So when Jesus rose again, when he was put to death and rose again, he showed through his resurrection that there's only one truly divine living God. I defy anyone to tell me that anyone's worshipped an idol and they've seen that idol raise someone from the dead. Hasn't happened. Right? There's no recorded incident in history of that happening. And yet we follow a Lord who has actually risen from the dead. So it sets our faith apart from any other form of worship. So for God's chosen people, the Jews, this fulfilled the prophecy of the coming Messiah, whether they accepted it or not. For the Gentiles, this enabled them to understand that all their false gods were powerless to perform miracles of healing, were unable to raise the dead to life, and most certainly were incapable of love. This enabled those without faith, who can only believe in what the senses tell them, to come to faith through Jesus, the Son of God. So we hear in the Bible, in the New Testament, with Paul, you know, he went out and he spoke to the Gentiles, didn't he? So the Gentiles he was speaking to, they weren't Jews, they weren't followers of God's laws, they were actually following various idols. So when he went out, he went to contest those idols, and he had to show whom God was through Jesus, right? So when he went out and ministered to people, there was things that were happening, and the Holy Spirit was at work that changed people's faith from worshipping idols into worshipping a living God. So we have to understand that Jesus was born the son of Jewish parents. His life until he was crucified was focused on his own people. However, after fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy and raising from the dead, the lack of faith from the Jewish people led Jesus to bring a new covenant to all people, myself included. So Jesus instructs his disciples to bring all people to God, Jew and Gentile alike. And this is why we talk about this today, because it means all people, no matter what people believe, whatever they worship. Part of our call is to actually go out to those people and to share the gospel, isn't it? So that's what we're told to do. Now, in the ancient times, when we have a look back in any form of ancient documentation, we'll find out that the letters EL that we use for naming God, right, in Hebrew, is actually the same two letters that was used by many different languages. So in ancient documentation, it was hard to differentiate between God, whom we know, and God meaning an idol, because the actual letters were exactly the same. So when people were using terminology, it was easy to get confused. So in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the main word that was used for God was actually Elohim. Okay, so E-L-O-H-I-M. The form L is also used, but less prevalent, as the name Yahweh. Does anyone know what the name Yahweh means? It isn't an acronym. In Hebrew, there's no vowel, so it's actually YHWH, but someone's phonetically put vowels in so we can say it, assuming this would be the closest way of saying it. But it actually means something. So we use this. What does it mean? Anyone know what it means?
Say it again.
Yahweh.
Oh, I've heard it.
Any thoughts? So we say Jehovah Jireh, God is our provider, but we also have Yahweh Jireh. But what does that actually mean? Okay, so Yahweh actually means he causes to be, or he creates. So it's actually identifying God separate to anything else, because he's the creator God. He's not a God of, he's the creator of all. There's a difference between the two. When we talk about all these different idols over all of the centuries, they're a God of something, right? But Yahweh actually means he creates, or the God of all. So that's the difference in it. Now all three of these names, they refer to Abraham's God, the God of Israel. But by early post-biblical times, the name Yahweh was no longer pronounced, as I just mentioned. So modern Judaism replaced it with a different word. What do you think they replaced it with? You all know it. But do you remember which one I mean? What was Yahweh replaced with? So people today in Israel, if they're singing about God, their Lord and their Master, they will use a particular word. We use it in songs that we sing too sometimes. It's actually Adonai.
Yes.
Okay? So Adonai means Lord and Master. So Yahweh, this unpronounceable word, because it doesn't have any A and it doesn't have any E, was actually changed to Adonai by the Jewish people. Okay, so that's where that word actually came from.
Why?
So when we're reading it in the Bible, right, we only get Lord in the English Bible. But if we actually read a translation which keeps the words in Hebrew, we actually will get different words for God in different parts of the Bible. So Adonai is actually what was replaced.
Why did they change it?
Because Yahweh is actually not a word. It was unpronounceable. Okay? So it was actually changed. There's some words that people use. It's like God, you know. You see people write it G_D, and they say, oh, you can't say the name God. And people say, oh, why is it too holy? We're not allowed to say it. Well, no. It's because when you actually write it, there's no vowel. So it's just GD. So the vowel O has been put in. So you've got to realise there's a difference in the translation from the original Hebrew to how we say things in English. So this is one of those examples. So we go from...
The other thing, just to add
Sure.
to that they wouldn't use the word Yahweh because of do not use God's name in vain.
Yes.
And because it was holy, and they did not want to sin.
Yep.
So that's why they had Elohim, they had El Shaddai, they had many other
Yes.
words, even today.
All the descriptive attributes of God were given different names. El something, that's right. That's correct.
Even when they wrote that,
Yes.
example, they would throw the ink, they would have a mark. It was a big ceremony before you even wrote that.
That's right. That's
So,
right.
yeah, in one sense, they had a fear of God, really. They
Absolutely.
feared God. So that
Completely
was a
agree.
good thing.
Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because today we actually make it a pronounceable word. So we've lost some of the reverence for the word, perhaps,
Yes.
and we've actually made it pronounceable so we can actually say a word. Huge respect for these people, and there was a huge reverence of these people for God's word, because they were responsible for actually communicating what God said to his people, and that's how it worked. So we're going to take another step now. So Christianity replaced Yahweh with a word as well. I sort of already spilt the beans, but we call it Lord. So we have this progression of these words, and so today we actually look this up. We see all these different versions of the same word, but that's because of the change in time and the change in language along the way. Okay, so imagine in ancient times, like everything, there's less differences. Ancient biblical Hebrew, for example, is different to modern Hebrew today. There's words in the Bible which they don't pronounce today in Hebrew. There's Hebrew words today that weren't in the Bible. Okay? So they've sort of, the rabbis over the years have added words. They said, well, this is no good, we can't communicate, so they add words. It's written in Hebrew script, right? But they're not biblical Hebrew. There is a difference between the two. So what I'm learning is biblical Hebrew, not modern Hebrew. And the biblical Hebrew, there's a bunch of words. So when it first started early in the piece, they didn't have any vowels, right? So words were all these letters, like we're talking about with Yahweh, with the middle bits missing. God was GD. So you can imagine if you read the word and then you had to transfer that into language to speak to someone, it would have been a very skilled person who was able to actually do that. But the language was much more simple originally. Okay? Alright, so we'll keep moving on. So from the time of Abraham, God became a personal God. So we're talking about his personal God because he's in relationship with him. Okay? He made a covenant with Abraham and promised him divine protection. The word personal is used to reflect the direct nature of the relationship between God and Abraham, as there is no mediation either by prophets or priests. We know that Abraham communicated directly with God. Later on, the communication wasn't direct, okay, but then it was. So in the ancient Near East, gods were not unique, and they were shared throughout the region, as I'm mentioning. However, God's covenant that protected Abraham's people was unique. It was set them apart from all other people. Okay, so understanding the difference between the true living God and false gods, in which there was vile acts committed. Okay, and we're going to go into some of having a look at some examples. By society at the time, we understand why God was so repulsed and he was angry at those who abandoned faith in him, and how history is shaped now directly as a result of what happened back then. The ancient beliefs of Abraham's descendants through his son Isaac will see the Israelites end up living in Egypt. Right? They'll occupy the land of Canaan, which is the land occupied by modern day Israel today. They'll battle with their neighbours. They'll become vassal states of the Assyrians, of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans. Right? Their circumstances weren't smooth, and there was people who conquered them all the time, and with those people who conquered them came all of their gods. And so when people won a battle in those days, they believed that they won the battle because their God was mightier than the God of Israel. So all these people that came against the Israelites, they said, well, God's not so strong, is he, because we won. So this is how they would actually look. They would look at it. So for 2,000 years, beginning with the call of Abraham, God's people will abandon him repetitively for idolatrous worship of false gods. Many will practice, as I said, henotheism. They'll worship other gods simultaneously as they worship God. Who knows that happens all the time today? We may walk with the Lord, and yet we're also walking with other things in our life as well.
You know how you said that they were worshipping God but then also worshipping like another God? Doesn't that mean they're not worshipping God?
Well, it's stating that they were doing both. Solomon knew God. Solomon built the Temple of Jerusalem. Right? Solomon was given wisdom. Solomon did many great things when he was first king. And yet by the time he was the end of being a king, the nation was divided as a consequence of what he did wrong. And that was because he intermarried, and all of the women from different nations brought their beliefs with him. And Solomon allowed that to actually happen. So as a consequence, the temple was still there, the worship of God was still happening, but at the same time in the background, in the Valley of Hinnom, people were down there sacrificing children and all the rest of it at the same time. Okay? He's the king, it's his land, and he allowed this to happen. So henotheism is very, very much a real thing. So where was I? So in this story with this henotheism, we find that God will punish them. So I'm really giving you a little bit of an overview of the Old Testament, particularly at the moment. But God will punish them when they're wicked, and then he prospers them when they're faithful. So we hear about this in the Bible, how their fortunes change. It's an extraordinary journey that's completed with the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. So our Bible, we have all of the story of the Old Testament, and then we have the New Testament when Jesus came. Jesus came for a reason. Right? So everything that came before led to Jesus coming. The prophets tell us that he will come. But the why will he come is actually contained in the Old Testament, and it's because people keep walking away from God. They keep worshipping other things. And one of God's commandments, of course, is that you shan't worship any other God before me. Right? God is qua. He is a jealous God. Right? So this is part of the story, the journey of the Bible. So a new covenant replaces the old, and all people are given the opportunity to be restored into relationship with God. The legacy, of course, is that we have a difference now between two religions, if you want to call that. We have Judaism and we have Christianity. We're all walking with the same Lord. The difference is, of course, is that our Messiah has come. Right? We're waiting for him to come back. In Judaism, they believe in the Messiah, they just don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay? But up until Jesus, there's no difference. So our Old Testament, as we say before, is the same as the Hebrew Bible. It's the same testament, the same journey, the same story, the same people. Okay, so when God scattered the people who built the Tower of Babel, at that point in time in history, they're outside of relationship with him. But when Abraham was called by God, he was the first to turn away from the worship of false idols. So Abraham's journey of faith was the first step of God's plan. Of God's plan to reunite the scattered races of people. So let's ask this question. If the God of Abraham is the one true living God, how can we tell when someone is talking about the one true God? Big question. If the God of Abraham, if we accept that the God of Abraham is a truly living God, how can we tell when someone's talking about the same God? How can we tell?
What do you mean? When we read the Bible, or?
Well, not necessarily. No. So if you're speaking to people today, and we're speaking to, say you're speaking to a Muslim person, say you're speaking to an Indian person, they talk about God as well. Okay? So many other religions talk about God being God. But how do we determine if someone's talking about the same God that we believe? Challenging question, isn't it?
Need to ask a lot of questions just to find out who their God is.
Right.
Because God is, I'm sorry, but God today is very, very broad. It's very, very broad. So it could mean a lot of things, you know. So yeah, you need to ask a lot of questions. That way you know exactly what they're thinking, who their God is, and that. But there are many gods today, just like in the olden time. It hasn't changed, has it?
Does it align up with what the Bible says?
Right. So we use our Bible as a barometer, yeah, to actually, I guess, compare, you know, which one's which. You know, just keep in mind, we just talked about the fact that there's all these different gods, and I'm going to go into some examples from the Bible, so we can sort of get a head around about who some of these gods are, what people believe, what they did in their name, just to get a picture of, all these things that God warns us against. They're in our Bible, but do you actually ever understand what they actually are, what people believe and what they do in their name? Usually we don't look at it that way, but it affects us. So I'll just read this out. So the answer is important. It's actually found in Paul's letter to the Romans. Okay, when he writes about pagans in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 to 21. It says, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served things rather than the Creator." So if you want to find out, is someone worshipping the same God, find out what's important to them. Find out what they place as the most important thing in their life. See if there's anything that's placed between them and God. Anything. Absolutely anything. One of the things the Bible talks about is we can't have two gods. We can't serve money and God. So sometimes we say, money is some people's God. They make it more important to get lots of money and earn and be wealthy than it is actually to walk with God. So that's an example. That's a modern day example that we can use. But Paul's made it quite clear that any physical object, anything that people place as more important than God himself, then we can tell from that they're not worshipping a living God, which is what I was saying with the question. Okay, so again, that's Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 21. So Paul says that we can perceive God's truth from creation, in essence is what he's saying. Right? We don't see God as a separate created image, as God's eternal power and divine nature is obvious from the world around us. So basically when we walk through this world, that's the evidence of God the Creator. Everything. Right? We live on the planet that he created. We breathe the air that he created. We eat the food from the plants that he created. We have animals from whom he created. So everything is about God. Everything we produce today is made from those resources that God included in this earth. Gas, petrol, rock, timber from trees, food that we eat. It's all come from something that was created before us. And yet we use it today, we turn it into a secondary product and we say, look what I did. Okay, so God the Creator creates life. In Genesis 2:7 it says, he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life and the man became a living being. Who knows that every baby that's born is as a result of God? The baby doesn't suddenly switch itself on and say, I'm alive. The old movies used to show the black and white verse, didn't they? They used to pick up the baby by the feet and there'd be a smack on the bum and suddenly, wah, and the babies are like, sorry, that's just a load of rubbish. Clearly, right? God breathes life. So anyone who doesn't think they've had a miracle in life, well, you must be dead. If you're breathing today, you're a miracle. Right? Because God breathed into you. Miracles happen when God does something supernaturally in your life. So to breathe air and be alive today means that you've already received the miracle of life, as we call it, from God. Life is given by God. Is there any woman in the room or online who sets out to have a baby and then manufactures the baby and knows how it happens? Can any of you do that? It's extraordinary, isn't it? 9 to 10 months and suddenly there's this little human being. It comes out of our bodies. We don't know how to do it. If you can't accept the miracle from this stuff, you're not thinking the right way. So we've got to realise that God breathes life in. And the reason we say that as well is because there's other aspects to us as human beings, isn't there? It's not just a breathing organism. There's lots of breathing organisms. Right? You have a mind. You have the capacity to reason. You have a heart. You can love. You have a soul. You have emotions. Right? You have a spirit. People talk about spiritual journeys and being spiritual all the way through their life and don't know God. But they still use this word spiritual. Where does it come from? It only comes from one place. God is a spirit. God the Creator is a spirit. So we have to realise that this whole story, the story of the Old Testament, the Bible, is a battle. It's a battlefield. God versus false gods. Living God with his people pulled out through Abraham to battle against all other people of all nations who no longer have a relationship with him. God didn't create us to be outside a relationship with him. This is why he sent Jesus. Because man wasn't doing very well. So the story of the Old Testament is like a revolving wheel. Right? All these problems, all these journeys, all these kings, all these people conquering all parts of the world. You know, this Alexander the greatest conqueror, well, he was dead in his 30s and it fell apart. Right? King Cyrus the Great released them from Babylonian captivity, didn't he? A few generations of kings, and what happened? No more Persians. It just keeps happening and happening. It just tells us that as human beings we are not in control on this earth. We cannot make or manufacture anything that dominates other people and forces their will outside of our relationship with God. It's not possible. God will always win. So here we are 4,000 years later and we're still worshipping God. There's billions of people around this world who worship God. So tell me that this is not truth. This is very real. The difference is that we're saying is because it's not a physical object, it requires faith. We have to believe in something that we cannot see. Doesn't mean that it's not real. Okay? So, but the makers, we go to 2 Kings 16 verse 3, it says, but the makers and worshippers of idols and false gods choose death. Why? Because it says they sacrifice his son in the fire. This is one example. Okay? Who sacrifices their son in a fire to appease an angry God? Do you seriously think by killing another person that you're going to please God when God says thou shalt not kill? That means that if I do this action, then I can control what God's going to do for me, doesn't it? I do something to you, now God's going to bless me. This is the problem. We've got this right through our society. You know, we have a modern version of it too. In Western society, it's a lot softer, but it's still there. Even within Christianity, you know, the conversation about sacrificial giving and tithing and all the rest of it. And there's always this mentality that tends to come with it, that if I'm obedient, then I will get more. God will bless us, and God asks us to do what God asks us to do. But it's not Pavlov's dog. It's not like, God, I gave this, so you've got to give me 10 times back. We don't control what God does. God blesses us by our obedience to him. We're not being obedient to God by saying, I'm going to do this, now I expect this portion back. That can be completely outside of God's will. So this is this journey through the Old Testament. So when Abraham was born, he was raised, as I said, to worship false gods. They were prevalent everywhere. When he went into the land of Canaan, you have to realise there was false gods everywhere. When he went down to Egypt with Sarai, there was false gods everywhere. When Sarai went into the Pharaoh's harem, what do you think was happening? The Pharaoh was seen as a god. So if she's being prepared to see the Pharaoh, what do you imagine is actually happening to her? Right? She's not in there waving the flag for God. She's going to have to be obedient in that household, otherwise there's going to be a consequence for her. It's the other way around. So this is the journey of the Bible. So before we continue any further, as we're going to go right through the genealogy of Jesus, we're going to follow all of the descendants. I'm just taking this pause to talk about this topic because you have to understand what's going on. Because all of the story, it's like placing yourself in the land itself. You can't understand it in context if you actually don't know what people are believing, what they're thinking, and what's actually happening around them. Right? What do authors do today? We try and write to bring things to life, and you go, oh, yeah, the more graphic it is, the more realistic it seems, right? Look what's happened to the cinemas. Yeah, when people get shot or blown apart, they literally looks like they get shot and blown apart. We don't have to pretend anymore. It's so graphic that it's real. Why does that happen? Right? Because man wants to believe in such a way that they want to replicate things in a physical way all the time. Same as them producing these gods in the past. So, in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 32, verse 25, God said, "Nor did it enter my mind that they," he's talking about the Israelites, "should do such a detestable thing." Okay, so God's saying these are God's people. He gave them his laws, he gave them the priesthood, he gave them so much, and he says himself, I had no idea that they would still do these things. Okay? So it's obviously very challenging when you know, it's like bringing up a child, isn't it? You teach them all the right things and yet they still do the wrong thing, and you think, what else have I got to do? God took to talking about his people and saying they're a stiff-necked people. They're blind and deaf. They sound like insults, but the reality is that it seemed that no matter what he did, they just didn't listen. They kept going down the wrong path. And this path that they keep going down is influenced by what they believe. Who knows in life, if we don't believe in anything, then life has no value. You've got to believe in something. If people are poor, they believe that one day that they'll be wealthy. If people are hungry, they believe that one day they'll get food. People who work believe one day that I'll be able to buy a house or put my kids through school for an education, right? Otherwise we don't do it. Why bother? Okay? So these are the sort of things that happen as a result of worshipping and believing the wrong thing. So what we're going to do is, I selected a few of the main idols in the Bible, examples. Okay, ones that are fairly prevalent and ones that are considered to be some of the worst in the Bible, in order that you can sort of see what's going on, and the different snapshots from different times, okay? So you'll see what's happening. So the first one I'm going to have a look at is called Ammon. This is Ammon. So Ammon, he was called Amun as well, A-M-U-N. Ammon was an Egyptian god, okay? So this particular god was a local deity, as they call it. Remember we said that man creates them, so they're not the real god. They were a local deity in Thebes in Egypt. Now that deity was around the time of Abraham, so that means that when they went down to Egypt, this deity was being worshipped. Okay? He was worshipped as a god of, anyone know? This is all in your Bible, by the way. Does anyone know what Ammon was worshipped for? Okay. So these are the things. This is how my mind works. I want to know. Okay. I want to understand, why do people think what they think? Why do they do what they do? Okay. Ammon, he was worshipped as a god of creation. So he was deemed to create himself and then his surroundings. So what does that say about God the Creator? It's not necessary. Right? This guy is self-created. So obviously when Abraham and Sarai go down to Egypt, and later on when Joseph goes down, these gods are there. Right? So they're not believing in the God of Abraham. They're believing that they've got this God that created himself. So Thebes was the Greek name for the city. It was originally called Wasset in ancient Egypt, and it's on the east bank of the Nile River in what's the modern city of Luxor today. So this is where this idol originated from. So different parts of Egypt, they had different idols. Different cities worshipped different things, different pharaohs. They used to come into power and then they'd say, okay, I'm going to worship this one, we no longer follow the other one.
Was there ever like a war, like not a war, but like a mini fight of something in Egypt about like people saying, nah, that's not real, this is real?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the most famous, who's the most recognisable pharaoh today? If I asked you to name a pharaoh, who would you say? Tutankhamun. Do you know he originally wasn't called Tutankhamun? And I will teach on this. He was actually called Tutankhaten. There was two types of sun gods. His father actually built the city that's halfway down the River Nile, separate from all the other cities. Right? It lasted for 40 years and now it doesn't exist again. What he did is he said the polytheism in the country, all the different idols are no longer. Now you're going to worship this one. This is my God, this is the only God. You know what effect that had in the country? Priests had a lot of power. There was money, there was tithes, there was offerings. They were wealthy people. They influenced politics, they influenced the culture socially. It was elevated to national importance when the people of Thebes overthrew the Hyksos. So these are the rulers that they thought came down from Canaan. And they ruled over the region in the eastern Nile Delta. Perceived to be powerful after this victory, this god was fused with the sun god Ra, and known thereafter as Amun-Ra, king of the gods. There's lots of movies about Amun-Ra. Okay, king of the gods. So what they did is you had a powerful god and another powerful god. Well, let's join them together and we've got an even more powerful god. Doesn't sound like a real god, does it? But that's what they did. It's crazy. Okay, so when we have a look in the Bible, in 609 BC we have Pharaoh Necho, N-E-C-O. Right, he led an army north to join the Assyrian Emperor Ashur-uballit in a battle against the future king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar II, who you all know. On his way north, Josiah, the Israelite king of the southern kingdom of Judah, confronted him when he tried to take his army through his kingdom. What happened to Josiah? He got killed. He was actually told to stay out of it, but he didn't, because he didn't believe them, and he ended up dying. Right? This is all connected to this idol. So forced to engage in battle, Pharaoh Necho killed King Josiah, but lost time and arrived late to support the Assyrians in battle. So Jehoahaz was freely elected to replace his Pharaoh as the new king of Judah. But Pharaoh Necho had other ideas and deposed him and placed his brother Jehoiakim on the throne. So we start to hear all these biblical kings. They're all connected. He forced the king of Judah to become a vassal state of Egypt, requiring them to pay heavy tribute, which is taxes. Eventually they joined the Assyrians to lay siege to Haran, which is of course where Abraham left his father. Right, this place is still in play. They failed and regrouped in Syria. In 605 the Assyrian and the Egyptian allies fought the Babylonians in the battle of Carchemish, but their armies were decimated. The Assyrian Empire came to an end. So there's the end of the story of the Assyrian Empire in the Bible. Right? When that happened, Pharaoh Necho returned to Egypt with a remnant of his army and took Jehoahaz, the Jewish king, with him that had been deposed. The king of Judah became a vassal state of the emerging Babylonian Empire, required to pay tribute to King Nebuchadnezzar II. So this king and this god was in play and failed at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so these are all parts of the Bible. This is all in the Bible. So King Nebuchadnezzar continued to expand his empire, and he kept trying to invade Egypt. But unsuccessful for 3 years, King Jehoiakim foolishly switched sides back to Egypt because he believed the king of Judah could rebel against the Babylonians who couldn't defeat Egypt. He was subsequently killed in 598 BC after King Nebuchadnezzar invaded the kingdom of Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem. So this is all the story of the Bible. This account explains how God used the Babylonians. So this is another thing we learn in the Bible with these false gods and with our God. This account explains how God used the Babylonians to punish the people of Judah. In Jeremiah 44:5 he said, "They did not turn from their wickedness or stop burning incense to other gods." So God uses a power who worships other gods to punish his own people who are worshipping other gods. So these gods are in play all the time. It's also revealed that God used one nation to punish another, as I've said. And in Jeremiah 46 verses 25 to 26 he says, "I'm about to bring punishment on Ammon, god of Thebes," that's how specific the Bible is, "on Pharaoh, on Egypt and her gods and her kings, and on those who rely on Pharaoh. I will hand them over to those who seek their lives, to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, and his officers." Okay? So we have this story of Ammon in the Bible, and this whole changeover from the Egyptians and Nebuchadnezzar all happened around this particular king.
When God would use another nation to punish his nation, would that other nation still lose like their soldiers?
I guess so.
Didn't tell.
I guess so. They still fight. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next God we're going to have a look at, so I'm just going to rattle through a few of these. So I've printed these pictures. So the next God is Asherah. Has everyone heard of Asherah?
Yeah.
Asherah is very prevalent in the Bible. Okay, so this picture shows a public ceremony where there's an Asherah pole. So that's that wooden pole. Do you know they're still around today? Do you know in America they're making a resurgence in bars? People are going to bars and drinking alcohol and dancing around these things today. Right? From all these years ago, it's happening again today. It hasn't stopped. So you think this stuff is all ancient, it's still going on. The other part of this picture shows a various idols in the background, and then it also shows two people with no clothes on top of a raised platform there. Okay? In public amongst all these other people. You want to know why God was displeased and disgusted? I'm going to tell you why. So this is another one of those gods that we'll give example to. Okay. So here's where we get into all these names we mentioned a little bit earlier. Asherah was a consort of, in history, of El, God, but not the same God. The chief god of Canaan. So the chief god of Canaan, so Abraham went into Canaan and he's following God, El, Elohim, El Shaddai, all the various names that we attribute to him. But they're also calling their God the same. But so when they're talking the same words, they're actually talking about a different God. So you can see that the other people who saw Abraham wouldn't be looking at it the same way as he was, because he knew a living God, they didn't. But the God was still called the same. So this particular God was accepted as a sea goddess. She was worshipped for fertility. Priests of both gender, male and female, performed public fertility rites to mimic both El and Asherah. So there was basically sacred prostitution, which was part of what that picture is depicting very nicely. Okay, so it was normal with these old ancient times that people would actually go to public places and people would engage in physical activity publicly with people watching. You want to know why God's disgusted? This is what they did. Right? And it's not just for this God, it's for multiple of them. So they were replicating El, meaning the male, and Asherah, meaning the female. So they were basically play acting, if you will, what they believed. So the priesthood were also, they were known as holy prostitutes. Right? Different to how we perceive priests, obviously. And they were also made available to worshippers in the belief that fertility would ensue by copulating with other people. So you can just imagine the scene that was going on. So you want to know why God's angry? This is what they actually did. This is all recorded in history, this stuff, if any of you can find this. But it's also recorded in the Bible. And that's the whole point. The Bible always tells the truth and history agrees with what the Bible says. So basically wooden poles known as Asherim, which I just mentioned, they were placed in Asherah's honour near other pagan objects of worship. Again, when you read your Bible, these names are all through your Bible in the Old Testament. Right? Prior to the people of Israel entering the land of Canaan, God said to Moses in Exodus 34, chapter 12, verse 14, "Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous," in Hebrew that's Qanna, Q-A-N-N-A, there's another name for God, is a jealous God. So prevalent throughout Canaan, God forewarned his people, but soon after they settled in the promised land, they forsook their Lord and served the idols of Asherah and Baal. So Baal's another one we're going to have a look at. Baal means Lord or Master in another language, right? The same as Adonai. In Judges 3:7, it says, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs." So this is just going on all the way through the Bible, through the times of kings, through the times of judges. So this is just all around. You can just imagine the influence that were actually on them. Okay, so the history and the development of the Israelites was very poor after they actually went into the land of Canaan. Okay, even though God raised up leaders called judges to administer his laws, society was often steeped in lawlessness and the worship of other gods. Remember before they even got into the land, the Baal of Peor? Right, the Israelites were encamped on the other side of the Jordan River, and some of the men decided that the prostitutes used to come down into the actual camp and say, come up here with us and you can get some meat to eat, because they were sacrificing animals. And so here we've got these Israelites, they've been in the desert for 40 years, all they've eaten is manna, and someone comes along and says, well, come with us, you'll have a good time, we'll give you some meat to eat. Too much temptation, a lot of them went. Okay? Again, all in the Bible. So the goddess Asherah is often worshipped together with Baal, as I've mentioned, and they're very prevalent. So although God Almighty was the sovereign ruler of the Israelites, lawlessness in the land led his people to request an earthly monarchy during the time of the last judge Samuel. Now God allowed this, but then many of the Israelite kings either allowed or led their people to worship other gods, so God punished them severely. Ironically, they were led off in captivity by foreign powers who worshipped foreign gods. That's what happened to them. You want it? You get it. So God's punishment of people who actually worship foreign gods, well, they got it non-stop after that. So this is what the Bible teaches us. So an illustration of this disobedience, this is one example, is evidence with King Ahab in your Bible, who ruled the northern kingdom of Israel between 874 and 854 BC. He built a temple for the worship of Baal in the capital city, which was called Samaria at the time. And in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 32 to 33, it says, he set up an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord. So basically the northern kingdom, when they separated from the southern kingdom, they didn't worship the Lord at all. The golden calves were placed at either end of the boundaries, at Bethel and up at Dan, and in between they're worshipping every other god that they could think of. So this is what the scriptures tell us. So the influence for this came from disobeying another God's commandments. And in Deuteronomy 6, verses 3 to 4, it says, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons, and take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So all the way through the Bible, God is giving warning after warning after warning, don't intermarry, don't follow these other gods, etc., etc., etc. So King Ahab's wife, famous, anyone remember her name? Jezebel. Yeah, thank you. She was the daughter of King Ethbaal, is his name. King Ethbaal of Sidon. So Sidon's up in today's Lebanon. A woman raised to worship Baal. So she married this Jewish king. What do you think is going to happen? So God sent his prophet Elijah to warn King Ahab that a severe drought would grip the northern kingdom of Israel as a punishment for leading his people to worship these gods. So the story tells us about how they had to prove that their God was real, and they laid the bulls out to be burnt on the altar. Of course, nothing happened, and then the bulls that were laid on the altar for Elijah, they burnt, and so they realised that God was a true living God. So the consequence was that all of those false prophets were all killed. Okay, so this is that story in the Bible. But when we're reading through that, the Holy Bible gives us an insight to the worship of other gods. So in 2 Kings, chapter 17, 9 to 11, the Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. Did you hear that? The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God. So they thought that because they can't see God, that God can't see them. And it says, from watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all the towns. So in other words, they're building these things everywhere. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. They use the word every. So they must have been everywhere. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. So in other words, they're replicating those that God got them to defeat. They're now doing what they did. So what was the point in getting rid of them? In 2 Kings chapter 17 again, this time verses 16 to 17, it says, furthermore, they forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts, so we're talking about the heavens now, and they worshipped Baal. So this is polytheism, isn't it? They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. But it's not just polytheism, it's henotheism, because it says here that the Israelites secretly did things. So here they are, worshipping the Lord, and secretly they're worshipping false idols. And here it's telling them not only did they burn incense, but it says they sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. So they were killing their children. They practiced divination and sorcery and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. The story is that the Assyrians come in and take them all out a bit later. So here's another example where people are doing these abhorrent things.
Yeah. If you don't mind me just saying, adding to that, sometimes we read the Bible and we just say, well, God was so harsh with his people.
Yeah.
We've got to understand two things. He gave them the right to choose right and wrong. We see that through the Bible, you know.
That's right.
The free choices we have as human beings to either obey or reject God's law.
Yeah.
But what we need to emphasize, and the Bible also, is his patience.
Yes.
He had patience for years. It's not just, you know, once they did it and they got punished. He had patience. And he knew that they were doing it wrong, and he had patience. And even Babylon, after they got destroyed and the little remnant that was left, God told them, don't go to Egypt. And the women stood up and said, look, you know, everything we did, our husband knew about it. And we did cakes to the Queen of Heaven. And we're going to continue doing it.
Yes.
So you could see the heart of man and how, but yet we see the mercy of God. God was very patient. Yet, if we look at the other gods had no patience. You obeyed them or not, you were going to die if you weren't going to obey them.
They killed in their name.
Exactly. But how God, even in the evil heart, he had so much patience and loving kindness. And that's why he says that God is a God of long suffering. He just waits and waits. So really, it's sad, the history, but yet you see how God, at the end of the day, had no other choice. You provoked him in such a way in his holiness, he had no other choice but the punishment.
Right. So we go back to that cycle that I talked about. Sin, punishment, rescue, restoration, story of the Old Testament, story of the New Testament. Right? So the thing is, in this, talk about long suffering, Abraham came 4,000 years ago, Jesus came 2,000 years ago, so God was persevering with these people for 2,000 years before Jesus came. So kind of pretty patient, 2,000 years. So that's the reality.
He's a God of covenant.
Right, but that's
He
right.
never goes back on his word.
That's right. So he still follows through no matter what. So it shows you what a love he has, doesn't it? Okay, so we're going to move on to two more. So we've got Baal and we've got Ashtoreth. So I put pictures here, and the reason for that is so you can get an idea of how ridiculous it is what people actually worship. Right? So Baal, he's that bronze statue, and when it was made, it had a spear in his hand. Okay. Right. The other one, Ashtoreth, you can see that she's got a little crescent moon on her head. So a deity has another deity. They're always often the case. This one's quite sophisticated. Its arms actually had pins and they're actually moved. Right? But these idols, these are household idols. These are small idols. This is what everybody had in the house. Lots of people still do. But that's what they actually look like. Now, she's a goddess of fertility, so she's got no clothes on. Quite common. Yeah? Statues and idols of women with no clothes. So that was the case then as well. So for Ashtoreth, she was also known as Astarte in the Bible, so she had two different names depending on the language with which it was written. When we read the Bible, we get two contexts. We get the story that's coming from the party that we're actually following in the Bible, and then we have the people who's actually in the story from foreign countries. So the opposite context means that they believe or do the same thing, but they're from a different place, and they have a different language. So they have these different names. So Ashtoreth or Astarte, they're the same. So she was a goddess that was popular in quite a few cultures. She was worshipped as an astral deity. I said she had the crescent moon on her head with the evening star, and as a goddess of fertility, sexuality and war. Like Asherah, there was a public fertility rite, like I explained. So there was, again, what they called consorts, holy prostitutes, priests and priestesses, and all that happened with Ashtoreth as well. So the Bible speaks of Ashtoreth in conjunction with Baal as a major god. So some gods are considered major, some gods are considered minor. It's not because one had more power than another. It's like the difference between the books of the prophets, where we've got the minor prophets and the major prophets. It just means that they were more prevalent. So if they're a major god, it means more people worshipped those particular gods. So in conjunction with Baal as a major god. In Judges 10:6, one of the examples when the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, it says they served the Baals and Ashtoreth. So the Bible keeps repeating these names and in conjunction together. So it's actually telling you a bit about them, because it doesn't say this one or that one, it says these together. The prophets denounced her worship many times, but although warned not to worship other gods, the Israelites who arrived in the land of Canaan worshipped Ashtoreth. Now, archaeologists, with this particular one, there's been a huge amount of these idols found, like an incredible amount apparently. So that's one of the reasons why they know that she's a major god or goddess, because they just found heaps and heaps of these things in archaeological digs. Okay, so obviously they were very prevalent. Now, there's conflict between the worship of Ashtoreth and the God of Israel at the end of the period of Judges in the time of Eli and the prophet Samuel. Saul, the first king of Israel, was killed in battle against the Philistines with his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa in northern Israel. The Philistines cut off King Saul's head and stripped off his armour. Now in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 9 to 10, it says, they sent messengers with them throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armour in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshean. The Philistines believed Ashtoreth was mightier than God. So like I was saying, if somebody lost and they proclaimed that the God of Israel was their God, then when they actually lost, they would say they're more powerful. How do we know that, for example? What happened? They took the Ark of the Covenant, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And they placed it in this temple with Dagon. We'll come to that a little bit later. Right? And what happened? We hear about how this statue keeps falling over and breaking all the time. That's God's hand on this thing. But they thought that if they took that object, that physical object, the Ark of the Covenant with the tablets inside, that they would then encapsulate the power of God. But of course, God's not in the box, clearly. But that's what people believe. So it's another example that shows you how they actually thought and what they actually did. So Solomon, the third king of Israel, married 700 foreign princesses and had 300 concubines. Each brought with them their belief in the other foreign gods. As Solomon grew old, this is from 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 3 to 5. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord. He followed. Listen, he followed. Not just he let them do. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. Okay? So, unfortunately, you know, we go to church and we often hear Solomon celebrated, don't we, as a man of great wisdom. He built the temple. There was lots of great things he did. But however, he fell from grace. Right? By the end of his rule, he turned this country into such a mess that God separated the nation. There was a punishment that came out of it. Right? God honoured him because when he first started with the Lord, he honoured God. He said, I won't do it in your lifetime, but when your son takes over, boom, everything's going to fall apart. And of course it did. And history tells us it did. So Rehoboam, King Solomon's son, suffered the consequence of his father's choices, and the United Kingdom split. Okay, so the next one is Baal. So Baal is derived from the Semitic word Baalu. The name of Baal means Lord or Master, which I've mentioned, and it was used for a variety of deities in the land of Canaan. Known as the God who created and gave fertility. So again, another creator god, so meaning that there's no God the creator. This bronze statue apparently created the world. And also associated with fertility, and that's why he's always associated with Ashtoreth, Astarte, etc., all the other ones. But he's also deemed the god of rain and storm. Thunder in the sky was attributed to the roar of his voice. The god of justice, feared by those who committed evil, and the god who was killed by his enemies and fell into the hands of death. Ancient people believed when Baal was under death's control, plants would wilt or die and procreation would be stopped. Okay? So this is why people used to sacrifice, because they think, well, something bad's happened, so if we give something, then it'll turn it around. Okay? So, so prior to settling in the land of Canaan, Moses led his people around the land of Moab and camped outside opposite Jericho. The Israelite men disgraced themselves in sexual rights with a Moabite woman. So in Numbers 25, 2-3, it says, Moabite women who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods, so Israel joined in worshipping the Baal of Peor. Okay, so this is an example. King Ahab, later, we've mentioned him before, he built a temple for Baal. Animals were sacrificed to Baal at one or often 7 different altars, and prayer was offered up to this god in worship. Prophets who presided over these proceedings on behalf of the people would cut themselves until bleeding. 1 Kings chapter 18:28 says, they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears as was their custom until their blood flowed. Could you picture that scene? So you can see what God's dealing with. His people are in this land. These are his people, and that's what they're actually doing. They're actually mutilating themselves in the belief of some foreign god. Crazy, isn't it? So I put a post up the other day about the Shia Muslims in Iraq. Slicing their heads open with huge big knives and their babies, and it's horrific. Right? They get a handle with chain with hooks on it like Jesus would be, and they flail their back until the skin comes off, and they march down bloodied through the streets, and they're proud of it. They actually believe that this will actually abate their sins. This is today. They do it every year. Right? So what we're talking about in the Bible in these ancient times, they're still doing it now. So this is the situation that we have. Okay, so the next one, there's another god called Chemosh. This particular god, there's no known image for it, but there's this thing called the Mesha stele. Okay, so I'll explain what this is. So steles were stones that they actually used to engrave. Happens all over the world. All the kings, the pharaohs did it. They would put all their achievements on there. A lot of it's not true. It's made up history, because you go to a museum in one country and their king says, I won this battle. You go to the museum in another country and their king says, no, I won this battle. They're in the museums today, believe you me. Not all history is true. Right? This is one of those examples. So here is the national deity of the Moabite people. Notice we keep talking about the Moabites. Who were the Moabites? They were the descendants of Lot. Right? So his name is thought to be destroyer or subduer or fish god, and there's little known about him. But the Bible has a fair bit to actually say about it. So when the Israelites travelled to the land of Canaan, they fought and defeated an army of Amorites. So this is before they went across the Jordan River on the other side, under King Sihon, who occupied the northern region of Moab. The Moabites who had been murdered and displaced by the Amorite king were called the people of Chemosh. The Bible in Numbers 21:29 says, woe to you, O Moab, you are destroyed, O people of Chemosh. He, your God, has given up his sons as fugitives and his daughters as captives to King Sihon. Okay? So this particular stele, I won't read all of this, but this particular stele says that there was a time when they actually overcame the Israelites later on in history. And what actually happens is they write on the stele that it's because their God was more powerful. Same thing. But this God is also one which the Bible tells us that there was sacrifice, and it's one of the most abhorrent gods. So we know they were sacrificing people, children, again.
You know how some people would sacrifice their children?
Yes.
What did they think that would give them back?
They thought that if they sacrificed children, it's actually all connected to fertility, because they think that their land's not fertile. Their wives aren't fertile, so they actually thought that, well, if I sacrifice this child, then I'll have more children. So they would sacrifice their firstborn in order that they would have more children. Because wealth in those days was by having a big family who all could work and all could contribute. So if they weren't having children, they used to kill some of them in order to have more children. Pretty strange, isn't it? But that's the reality. So the next one is Dagon. So I've done this illustration. This is actually come off a carving, a stone carving, and I've recreated this with colour, what it would have looked like based on the ancient writings. So now this is Dagon. This is the one that was actually in the temple where the Philistines had, and they took the Ark of the Covenant. So these priests, they would don this fish. We assume it's not a real fish, it would be pretty smelly.
Yeah.
right? And they had all these attributes in terms of what they were actually wearing. So these are the priestly garments, right? But it was deemed to be a fish god. So these are off these ancient rock carvings. Okay, so Dagon was classed as a fertility god from Mesopotamia. This is from where Abraham had come. And the symbol of fish was to do with fertility again, and the symbol of multiplying apparently. So this is what they actually believe. So there's a lot of different countries that actually followed this particular god, but it got taken up by the Philistines on the coast. A lot of people think, oh, they're on the coast, so it's fish, so it makes sense, but it had nothing to do with that. It actually came from Mesopotamia inland. It actually moved across to Sidon in today's Lebanon, and it moved down the coast to the Philistines. So they weren't the first to have it. In fact, they inherited it as it moved through. So in the Bible, the great example, as I said, they're talking about this is actually the Ark of the Covenant, as I mentioned. And in 1 Samuel 5:2, it says, the Israelites were beaten, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured and taken to the city Ashdod, where the Philistines carried the Ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. The following morning, they found the statue of Dagon lying prostrate on the Ark. Before the Ark, they set the statue upright, but again the following morning they found it prostrate. This time the head and hands had broken off, and only the body was left. The people of Ashdod and the surrounding territory were then afflicted with tumours. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, the Ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy upon Dagon our God. So 1 Samuel 5:7. So they're looking at the power of these gods based on these physical objects still. That's the mentality of them. So the story tells us that they moved up to city to city to city, all the different Philistine cities. And of course they all suffered tumours as well. So this is God's hand on these people. Like, what was he actually doing with all the tumours? Why do you think that was happening? Any thoughts? Why the tumours?
Because it's like sin.
Right. It is sin. But why every time the ark went from this location to that one did God send tumours upon them?
Well, to tell them that he's God. He's the only living God.
Right. There is something more. He wanted them
To send it back.
relinquish it. It's like a hot potato. Right? He was basically, there was a cause every time one of them had it, until they actually sent it back. They literally sent it back. So this is this god of Dagon. So with Dagon, again, there was all the usual things. There was fertility rites, and there was child sacrifice again with that. Now Molech, this is a second last one. Molech, this was considered one of the most abhorrent of the Bible. They actually have a very good idea, because the Bible is quite clear in its description of what it actually looked like. So this is Molech. So it was a big bronze statue with a half underneath it. Okay. This will go on to the video when I produce it later.
Isn't that why they put like babies in their hands and then it like burns them
So
alive?
I'll explain. So what would happen with this? This was the chief god of the Ammonites. The Ammonites were the other descendants of Lot. Okay, so once again we've got this descendants of Lot. So this was one of the prevalent things. This was considered one of the most detestable. The word Molech is, they believe, is derived from the word Melech, which is what's spoken in Hebrew, and Melech actually means king. Okay, so they said Molech was the king or a chief god, the king of the gods of the Ammonites, and he was worshipped all the way through Canaan and Phoenicia, so today's Lebanon. He was associated with life and reproduction, was often worshipped in conjunction again with the fertility goddesses Ashtoreth. The association obviously with prostitution, temple priests, etc., all the same. But they said they think that Molech idol was a large hollow brass statue of a man with a large bulging belly and the head of a bull, designed on the principle of an old-fashioned pot-bellied stove. The belly acts as the firebox, and a child laid on the hands of sacrifice would roll back into the fire of the belly cavity. The Holy Bible describes this practice as passing through the fire to Molech. So basically they put the baby on the hands like this, at the angle back, there's flames going, the baby basically rolled back, fall in the hole, and it would burn. You saw in the picture there's all these people beating drums and worshipping. They did that on purpose because they didn't want anyone to hear the screaming, the reality of this baby being sacrificed. So they would play this music, they would holler, they would scream, they would dance at the same time as this baby was being burned. Okay, this is horrendous. You can see the trouble that they went to actually do this as well. Now, through Moses, God tells the people of Israel before they enter the land of Canaan in Leviticus 18:21, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." So before they even got there, he's itemised this particular one: do not give your children. So obviously they've been doing it for a long time. So after forbidding the people of Israel to worship Molech by sacrificing their children, God goes further with an explanation of what the penalties will be if they disobey this command. And it's again in Leviticus chapter 20 verses 2 to 5. And it reads, "Any Israelite or any alien living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death." So here's the penalty. "The people of the community are to stone him. I will set my face against that man and I will cut him off from his people. For by giving his children to Molech he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the people of the community close their eyes when that man gives one of his children to Molech, and they fail to put him to death, I will set my face against that man and his family and will cut off from their people both him and all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Molech." So this is the first one you come across where God actually says that this is the punishment. They'll actually be killed for this. So obviously this evoked his ire, and he says why, and he even gives the method by which they would be punished. Okay? So you can imagine living this life, pretty horrific, isn't it? But this is the reality of the Bible. All the stories, all the kings, all of the stories that we read today, they're surrounded by this stuff that's actually going on. So there's more laws that follow in Leviticus about this. Let me just... Okay, so here from Jeremiah, there's a lot about this particular God, but the Bible fiercely denounces Molech, not simply because of the sin of adultery, but for the odious practice of sacrificing children by fire. The Hebrew prophet Jeremiah describes with horror the ancient rites, telling us that God says in chapter 32, verse 35, "They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Molech, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin." So again, this is all pretty horrific. Okay, there's more, but I won't go into them, but I just want to give you a good idea. We get this repeat story, basically fertility rites, temple prostitutes, priests, child sacrifice. This is basically what's going on in the land. So as Abraham's there and all his future descendants are there, this is going on around them all the time. So it's really quite horrific. So that, the whole idea is to give you some context for the Bible. When we read in Isaiah 44, Isaiah has a lot to say about this. So in verse 6 he says, "This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty, I am the first and the last, apart from me there is no God." So he makes a categorical claim that there is no other God excepting for him. In verses 9 to 11 he says, "All who make idols are nothing." So if you make idols, God considers you as nothing. "And the things they treasure are worthless. Those who speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their shame. Who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit him nothing? He and his kind will be put to shame. Craftsmen are nothing but men." Goes on in verses 12, 13 to 18. "The blacksmith takes a tool and works within the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. The carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline with a marker. He roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compasses. He shapes it in the form of a man in all his glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars, or perhaps took a cypress or oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine, and the rain made it grow." So in other words, the growth of the actual timber and the timber itself is not something that man made, it's something that God made. And yet he's actually using this to make an idol. And he goes on to say, "It is man's fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. But he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. He also warms himself and says, I am warm, I see the fire. From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, save me, you are my God. They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see, and their minds closed so they cannot understand. And finally in verse 19 he says, shall I bow down to a block of wood? So it's very, very strong words, and it's talking about the reality of taking something that God's created and forming it into an idol for man to actually worship in place of God who created the very thing that they're creating a God for. So it's quite bizarre, isn't it? So, all right. Well, I'll wrap up on that note. Is there any questions? It's a bit of an odd topic, and so we go back onto the journey next week. But it's really important for us to have context when we read the Bible. And we're about to go in the Bible and follow these people's journey. And you're going to come across false god after circumstance after circumstance, and it's all around this issue of these false gods. And today, we have this extraordinary situation, don't we? Because when you look back at these ancient times, and that the god like Moloch, right? It's pretty terrifying. So, but they were influential. Can you imagine people actually going and being there and watching this happen? Obviously, it sort of had some impact on people. They really believed that sacrificing a child would make a difference in their life, otherwise they wouldn't do it. Everybody did it. It had to be normal practice. That's why they were all doing it. So these high places and the music that they're playing and all this stuff was going on all the time. But how do we remember the God of Israel? Right? The God of Israel was known in a single ark, the Ark of the Covenant. And how was that presented to the people in ancient times? It was drawn around on a cart, and it was worshipped in a tent. In other words, it wasn't impressive to the eye, no one saw it. It was put inside the tent of meeting, no one saw it. So there was nothing there for people to actually witness that was incredible in terms of formed by man. Right? It was incredible, but they didn't get to see it. Right? What happened when they touched the ark? The men died. Right? So this was made for God, and it was to hold His covenant. So obviously we get through all this stuff. But if we look today, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you think that pagan worship has gone away, I googled the word pagan, and it came up with 13,700,000 entries. So you can imagine the plethora of things that are actually going on there. If we jump in a car, we can drive around and we can see all sorts of things, that people have in their homes and around the streets, don't we? So?
Dream things in the cars.
Yeah, look at the cars, that's right, the dream catchers are on the cars, thank goodness they seem to have died down, but Mount Tambourine seems to be going into all this stuff now. Mm-hmm. But, they're selling crystals, and, people believe that, a piece of pink quartz is going to have some magic healing powers and all this sort of stuff. So we've got all this around us today, and Paul's letter to the Romans makes it quite clear that those are the sort of things that people see as gods, and that's how we know that it's not a real living God, because they're objects made from what God created. That's how we actually know. So we have to understand that as we read the Bible, God condemns this. God sent Jesus for a reason, and this was still going on at the time of Jesus. Remember the statue of Zeus got put into the Temple of Jerusalem, right? And this was the start of the beginning of the Sadducees and the Pharisees at this point in time. But people stopped going to the temple, and that's when the synagogue started. So all part of the history and the journey through the Bible. So it's a big issue. All right. Well, I'll finish up there. Sorry.
Yeah, just a quick one. Sometimes we think that, like you were saying, it's a thing of the past.
Right.
And if we look at history itself, it tells us a lot that in our centuries, things have happened. You see the Mayas, the Aztecas,
Right.
child sacrifice.
Right.
Let's not see too far away, but let's look at the world of the occult.
Yes.
And that is so prevalent today. We see children being sacrificed. Let's even go even closer. We're close to Halloween. Halloween
Yes,
is probably
right.
one of the most important festivity in the occult, in the
Yes.
dark world. I mean, Halloween talks about, if that night, hundreds and thousands of children will be sacrificed worldwide.
Yeah.
So that's, and that's, for Satan, that's one of that's New
That's
Year
his
for
aim.
Satan. Yeah, so
Doesn't have to do
it's going to
anything.
be happening. It started 6 weeks prior. So you have a lot of that in England, in Australia. I used to
Yeah.
live in Sydney, so
Yeah.
we had that in Newcastle, Wollongong, many areas where you had people sacrificing children. We've helped people come out of the occult, and they speak about that and say, just tell us what they did, black mass and all that. And to make things even worse, you see in the world, then the day after they celebrate the Day of the Dead. Let's even look at further down there. We got Easter, we got hot cross buns, and they were cakes made in the pagan time, and they put a cross on it, but they were made out of human flesh and blood, and that was mixed. So there's a lot that we see paganism in our society. We just don't see it. I think our churches should wake up to the reality that exists in the day of today, and we as a church, as Christians, we should have knowledge of that and do something about it. I think it's a tremendous sin for people just ignoring it and saying, it doesn't happen, it doesn't affect me. Like what you were saying, dream catcher, that's a real thing. I've worked with people that have all these occultic new age things in the house, and then we ask God, why don't you bless us? But how is he going to bless when we have cursed things in our homes?
And they call it a spiritual journey. I'm looking for God.
Absolutely.